Before I begin, I will warn you that our guest has been in this room previously. When he was in this room previously, about 20 minutes before the end of the program, the District of Columbia had a necessity to turn out all of the power in this quadrant. The room went dark, and our guest continued speaking as if nothing had happened. So none of you bolt for the doors if we have an interruption. He knows how to continue on. Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions, reminding our internet viewers that questions or comments can be sent to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. For those in-house, your main duty at the moment is to check that your cell phones have been turned off before we begin. And we will, of course, post the program on our website for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our special guest today is Dr. Niall Gardner. Dr. Gardner is director of our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom and a former aide to Lady Thatcher. He has worked at the heart of the Washington policy world for over a decade and is a leading expert on the U.S.-UK special relationship. Dr. Gardner is a regular contributor to the London Daily Telegraph and appears frequently on American and British television. He received his doctorate in history from Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Niall Gardner. Niall?
John, thank you very much for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm honored to introduce a long-standing friend of Heritage and the American people, Daniel Hannan, a Conservative member of the European Parliament for South East England. I've known Dan for over 2 decades, since our days as students, studying modern history at Oriel College, Oxford, the alma mater of some of the greatest figures in British history, including Sir Walter Raleigh and Cecil Rhodes. We both owe a huge debt of gratitude to our senior tutor, Jeremy Cato, one of the most brilliant historians of his generation, and described by a Conservative MP as, quote, the quintessential Oxford Don. If one were to devour C.P. Snow, Goodbye Mr. Chips, and Porthouse Blue, there is a smattering of Cato in each. Dan graduated from Oxford with a double first, and soon after leaving university, he became director of the European Research Group and later a leader writer for the Daily Telegraph. He also served as an advisor and a speechwriter to both Michael Howard and William Hague in the late 1990s. In 1999, Dan entered the European Parliament, where he swiftly became a leading nemesis of Euro-federalists and Eurocrats. He is currently serving as the Secretary General of the Alliance of European Conservatives and Reformists in the European Parliament, which campaigns for radical reform of the European Union. No easy task, I might add, Dan. In addition to his work in Brussels, Daniel Hannan is one of the most prominent political commentators in Britain through his highly influential blog at the Daily Telegraph. His writing has become essential reading for anyone who wishes to learn more about the nightmare of the European project and why Britain needs to escape from it. He is also a distinguished transatlantic author who has made a significant impact in the United States with his New York Times bestseller, The New Road to Serfdom, A Letter of Warning to America. His latest book, Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World, is already making waves on this side of the Atlantic and is essential reading not only for America's political leaders, but for all who care about American global leadership and the future of the Anglosphere, the engine of the free world. We're delighted to have Daniel back here at Heritage with us today. Daniel.
Well, Niall, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back at Heritage, wonderful to see many old friends here, and indeed to be reminded of that power cut episode. I'll tell you why I naturally spoke through a power cut. It's because I was brought up in Peru. I'm very used to power cuts. They were a big part of my childhood. And one of the things I noticed when I moved from Peru to the United Kingdom is that power cuts didn't happen. Now, of course, this was before Labour started introducing all its green energy levies. Power cuts may now become a regular feature of UK life again. But the reason I say that is because it's human nature to take things for granted. Sometimes you need to have lived somewhere else. to appreciate what is unique about the place where you now find yourself. When I was 4 years old, a mob attacked our family farm. There was a footpath into the hills, a back entrance, and my mother led me there by the hand. And she said, "You know, we're going to play a game. If we have to come this way again, we must do it without making a sound." My father was recovering from one of those chronic diseases that periodically affect British people in tropical countries. I remember him, he was sitting in his dressing gown, loading his revolver with paper-thin hands, saying, "I'm not leaving. I have a responsibility to the people who work here. This was a piece of empty land, now it's a flourishing farm. These are hooligans who have been brought in from the city. What's going to happen to the farm workers?" Well, it makes an impression on you. In the event the danger passed, some security guards fired shots into the air, the crowd dispersed. It didn't happen everywhere. Not everyone was as lucky as we were. There were seizures and confiscations all over the country. This was the Peru of General Juan Velasco, whose leftist putsch in 1968 had thrown the country into a state of squalor from which it has only recently recovered. Almost everyone moved out during those gloomy years. The large Anglo-Peruvian community into which I'd been born pretty much disappeared. I may not look it, but I am your typical Latino target voter now, right? I am the demographic that you're all looking for. I am someone who has moved from the Hispanosphere to the Anglosphere. And I can't help noticing that the movement has been overwhelmingly one way, right? And it's worth standing back and asking why that is. The two great land masses of the New World might serve almost as a controlled experiment. They were settled at around the same time. In fact, during the 16th century, Spain was probably, on every measure, the stronger power than England. South America has the edge in terms of natural resources, and yet it never quite developed the civil democracy, the individualism, the freedom and the property rights that you take for granted. It was something that kept occurring to me when I was going to school in the UK and returning to Peru in vacations. That attack had not surprised anybody. That was the really shocking thing. It was assumed that property rights were contingent, that constitutions were ephemeral, that governments would come and go without any rule of law, that what you had could be snatched away at any moment with or without official sanction. And it was also taken for granted by Peruvians that such things didn't happen in the English-speaking world. Why is that? Why is it that this became such desirable living space, attracting people not just from South America, but people in their tens of millions from every continent and archipelago, by its dream and promise of freedom? You know, as I say, we take things for granted. The conceit of our age is to think that the things that we now take to be comfortable and modern and rational, such as regular elections and personal freedom and jury trials, equality between men and women, habeas corpus, uncensored newspapers, that these things are somehow the natural condition of an advanced society. That every country will get there when its people become educated enough and wealthy enough. History tells a rather different story. Those ideals were overwhelmingly developed in the language which I am now talking to you in. There are very few places where any of them emerged through, as it were, a process of parallel evolution. And you don't have to go back very far to find a time when freedom under the law was confined to the Anglosphere, to the community of free English-speaking democracies. On the 10th of August, 1941, Franklin Roosevelt made the longest walk of his presidency. In a way that is nowadays almost unimaginable, the US media had contrived to hide the fact of his polio from the electorate up until that moment. He'd always been photographed standing, unaided, or seated. But on that occasion, invited by Winston Churchill to join him on the decks of HMS Prince of Wales off Newfoundland, he was determined literally to rise to the occasion. And to the horror of his advisers, who'd worried that a rolling pitching deck might leave the president in an undignified heap, he made his slow way across the boards, leaning heavily on a cane, supported on one side by a naval officer and on the other by his son. The band of HMS Prince of Wales played Stars and Stripes Forever. And what followed was a carefully choreographed demonstration of what bound the English-speaking democracies together. Roosevelt had gone as far as he could to support the Anglosphere's war effort. But he was working within the constraints imposed on him by the founders of the Republic and then reinforced in a number of neutrality laws in the 1930s. He'd opened facilities to the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. He'd come out with the extraordinarily generous Lend-Lease agreement. He'd gone as far as a benign neutral can go within the law. And Churchill, trying to tempt America to take the extra step, needed to show that the consanguinity of doctrine between the English-speaking powers rested on a broader cultural affinity. And that was what he wanted to display that morning, the 10th of August, 1941. It happened to be a Sunday, and the crews of the two vessels, the USS Augusta, which had carried FDR, and HMS Prince of Wales, were paraded on deck for a joint religious service. Churchill had chosen every detail personally. He wanted everything to be perfect, down to the hymns, down to the readings, which of course came in the language of the King James Bible, alike revered in both nations. Chaplain read from Joshua 1, "As I was with Moses, so shall I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage." And afterwards, exultantly, the Prime Minister declared the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And when he said the same ideals, Churchill was not making some bland generalization about being the good guys. Think of the world as it appeared from the perspective of August 1941. The whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Seoul and Vladivostok to Brest and Lisbon, was under one form or another of authoritarian government. And you didn't even have the consolation of saying it's only become that way because of conquest by occupying armies. It's true that in a small number of countries, in Scandinavia, in France, and the Low Countries, parliamentary regimes had been overthrown by invaders. But there was a much longer list of countries that had turned from democracy and freedom to fascism or communism without needing to be invaded through their own domestic process. Nobody in those days thought there was anything inevitable about the triumph of what the Nazis and the communists both called decadent Anglo-Saxon liberalism. And they called it decadent for a reason. It looked as though it was on the way out. The coming idea was that you should marshal people together, that you should elevate the herd above the individual. They were confident that the future was theirs. How could a system that allowed the individual freedom over the collective possibly triumph over their systems that stressed discipline and martial valor and glory? Well, no one would have thought it at the time, but our system of government was superbly victorious, and thank God it was. It raised our species to a higher level of wealth and happiness than previous generations would have thought possible. But don't think that that was some natural process. The move away from oligarchy, away from autocracy, towards liberty under the law, towards individualism, happened in one place and in one language. Now, why? What was the secret ingredient? What made the Anglosphere miracle possible? Well, that's the question that I set out to answer in Inventing Freedom. I don't want to spoil the whole thing because I hope some of you are going to buy it. It's on sale afterwards, I'm told, outside. But I tried to approach the question as an anthropologist would. The real takeoff, we have old roots for some of these freedoms. They go right back to the Dark Ages. But the real takeoff began from the end of the 17th century. That was the move away from guilds and monopolies and aristocratic privilege towards modern contract-based individualist capitalism of the kind that we recognize today. So I thought, well, here's a way of tackling it. What did foreign visitors to North America and Great Britain during those years find remarkable? If there was something going on in the Anglosphere that wasn't happening elsewhere, you would expect overseas observers to notice. And we had some very distinguished men of letters visiting us throughout the 18th century and into the early 19th century. Voltaire and Montesquieu and Tocqueville and a host of less well-known ones who nonetheless kept journals and wrote letters home. And running through their observations are a number of common themes. First of all, they were struck by how materialistic we were. They found the English-speaking peoples uncommonly interested in profit. They were not very polite about it. They thought it demeaning. They thought that we'd forgotten about higher values. Again, thank God we had. I would rather live in a place that values freedom and privacy and the honest pursuit of self-betterment than in a place that lauds honor and faith and martial glory. They tend not to be very happy places to live in. They were stunned by religious pluralism, not by religious toleration. That existed in lots of places. But complete equality, including the freedom for every denomination to proselytize. That was pretty much a unique Anglosphere characteristic. The individualism, the elevation of personal freedom over raison d'etat, of the single owner over the extended family or the kin group. Again, they wondered at that. We had a remarkably weak system of extended families, both in law and in custom. And then something that they all noticed. Our countries were remote. Many of the Anglosphere states outside North America, in fact almost all of them, were literally islands. The Anglosphere beyond North America is an extended archipelago. Great Britain, Ireland, the Caribbean, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. And although the US, of course, is not an island, in geopolitical terms, it was more isolated than any of them. It had the mentality of an island nation. Look at Washington's farewell address, still reverentially read out in the Senate. Well, actually, who knows what the Senate are up to? They're tearing up all their rules. Even by the time I finish speaking, they'll have probably done away with that one. Or look at Jefferson's inaugural address, kindly separated by nature and the ocean from the exterminating havoc of 1/4 of the globe. These are people who felt secure in their geographical isolation. Why does that matter? An island country doesn't need an army in peacetime. That obsession running through all of the debates at the time of your foundation about standing armies, that was an ancient Anglosphere concern. You find exactly the same concerns in the 1640s, in the civil wars in Great Britain. Because there was no standing army in peacetime, the government lacked a mechanism for internal repression. When the regime wanted something from the people, usually tax, but anything else, it had to ask nicely. It had to summon people's representatives in an assembly, and that was the guarantor of constitutional government. And then one last thing, on which every foreign observer who was versed in the subject remarked, in fact, which they wrestled with, which to this day they still struggle with. I see this every week in the European Parliament. The miracle of the common law. In most countries, people have a variant of what they do in continental Europe, the Roman law or Bonapartist model, where a law is written down in the abstract and then applied to specific cases. That, you would have thought, is the natural way of doing it. And if you're raised in that tradition, you just gawp in wonder at the idea that somehow the law can just grow on its own, like a coral, case by case, each judgment serving as the starting point for the next case. The law came up from the people, not down from the regime. It was an ally of freedom, not an instrument of state control. Again and again, it laid itself across the path of tyranny, thwarting the Stuarts and George III, declaring that slavery was dissolved the moment someone set foot on English soil. That beautiful, anomalous system that John Adams recognized as the foundation of all Anglosphere freedoms, almost without precedent in the world. We've lost its roots. We don't know where it came from. But it has been the strongest friend and ally of liberty. Now, I should at this stage address those of you, since this is Washington, D.C., who are thinking, well, this is all fine, but surely these liberties were developed here. Wasn't this all kind of invented in 1776? And didn't we create this propositional nation based on liberty and so on? Well, look, I don't want to diminish that, right? I insisted on going to Philadelphia yesterday on my way here. My publisher said, no, don't go to Philly. There are no conservatives in Philly. You won't sell any books, right? And, right, you know, it's pretty much true. There are very few conservatives in Philadelphia, and I didn't sell many books. But how could you not go to Philadelphia if you're writing about Anglosphere exceptionalism, right? This is our Mecca, we English-speaking peoples. If we turned and faced somewhere 5 times a day to pray, our Kaaba stone would be that little brick building in Independence Hall, right? That's where our conception of liberty reached its highest and most sublime form. But the people who wrote those documents, the authors of the Declaration and then of the Constitution, they didn't think they were inventing any new rights. In modern parlance, they were not radicals, but conservatives. If they were revolutionaries, they meant the word in its 18th century term, whereby a revolution was a 360-degree turn of the wheel, a placing upright of that which had been turned on its head. They saw themselves not as defying or rejecting their British nationality, but rather asserting the privileges that they assumed they had been born with as Englishmen. And they traced a long lineage back through our glorious revolution, back through the Magna Carta, back to that folk right of Anglo-Saxon common law, which emerged in the earliest days, dark and unchronicled, before England had been formed out of the Heptarchy. Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, they were in no doubt that they were the beneficiaries of an ancient tradition whose roots dug deep into the cold and muddy soil of Great Britain. I always tell this story to skeptical friends here because it neatly illustrates how the story has been edited, rewritten. There was a time when every American schoolchild was taught about Paul Revere's ride, right? How he thundered through the townships of eastern Massachusetts with his cry of the British. I mean, I don't know if they teach anything in public schools here now, but there was a time, and some of you are looking pretty young, which is great, but there was a time when everyone was told this story. The British are coming, right? Now, you stop and think about that story for a few seconds, and you will realize that there is a pretty major flaw in it. Right? The entire population of Massachusetts was British at the time. I know that there are some eccentric people in Massachusetts. I know that they vote for some pretty strange candidates at election time. But even in Massachusetts, it would be a truly bizarre thing to shout the British are coming at a completely British population. Right? What he actually said, for the record, was the regulars are coming out. But my point is, look at how that story has been doctored. You know, the language that the tour guides now use at Lexington and Concord, the Americans were here, the British were here, no one would have recognized that at the time. Everyone involved was British. It didn't, before the French became involved in 1778, it didn't occur to anyone to treat this as a conflict between two different countries. It was seen for what it was, an argument within a common polity which divided public opinion on both sides of the Atlantic. You watch a Hollywood epic now, and you see people marching, under the stars and stripes, the famous Betsy Ross flag. Well, one or two of them did. But far more common was the Grand Union flag, the congressional flag, which had the Union colors in the corner and then the 13 stripes where they are now. And that symbolized what it was that the patriots thought they were fighting for, namely their rights as freeborn Englishmen, to use the phrase current at the time. In fact, even the word patriot is telling. Patriot, as it became here, people favoring the Ulster Scots dialect. Patriot was what Whigs on both sides of the Atlantic had called themselves for decades before anyone dreamed of a split. So when they talked about patriotism, what they meant was cherishing the exceptionalism of the Anglosphere model against the more statist, hierarchical alternatives that were favoured by Tories on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, why do I stress the uniqueness of these values? Well, it carries a big flip side. Britain and then the US defined their nationality in civil rather than ethnic terms. We were very unusual in Britain. We were very early in defining nationality not by blood or ancestry, but by signing up to a set of values. And as so often in the US, people distilled and took to greater potency a tendency that was present in the old country. This is a creedal polity. You become American because of what you believe, not because of where your ancestors were from. But think about that. It means that if you then change those values, you efface your identity much more thoroughly than a country which defines itself by blood or territory. If America ceases to be a polity based on the elevation of the individual, then it ceases to be American, much more thoroughly than anywhere else, right? Japan or Sweden or Ethiopia, they could be monarchies or republics. They could have state churches or they could be atheists. They could be capitalists or communists. They would still be recognizably the same countries. If this country gives up on the idea that the law is above the state and the individual is the master of the government rather than the other way around, it ceases to be American. At this point, I should nod to the current president for teeing me up so nicely on this point with his intervention yesterday. We don't want this pettifogging constitution standing in the way of what plainly there is a majority for. If you wanted to summarize Anglosphere exceptionalism in one phrase, you could do a lot worse than what John Adams said talking about the Massachusetts state constitution: a government of laws, not of men. Incidentally, that phrase was not John Adams's. He was quoting a 17th century English Whig called James Harrington, yet another illustration of the common roots of our shared inheritance. A government of laws, not of men. You don't get to change the system because of a transient majority. The law is above the state. It is not an expression of the will of the rulers. Now, for what it's worth, I do not share President Obama's view of what the founders intended. He said, they couldn't have possibly meant the Senate always to be blocking things. And you know what? I think that's exactly what they intended. That is the precise function of the Senate. It was supposed to act as a brake on the radicalism of the popularly elected House. Right? So, as far as I can see, blocking and delaying is not an abuse of its function. It is its function. But let's say I'm wrong about that. Let's say he's right and I'm wrong. He's not the guy who should get to decide, because he's a player on the pitch. He can't be the referee. That's what we mean by a government of laws, not of men. Once you start saying, I am bigger than the rules, once you lack the humility to see that you are passing through institutions that are greater than you are, you open the door to what your founders called arbitrary government. That is the responsibility that we have, to preserve intact our patrimony. This is why I like the name of this foundation: Heritage. Heritage is about teaching our kids that they are not a random set of individuals born to a different random set of individuals, but they are rather the inheritors of a unique and sublime tradition. I began with Paul Revere. Let me finish with the guy who sent him on his famous ride. Joseph Warren, medical doctor, was killed later in the fighting, leaving a young family. And just before he sent Paul Revere off on his ride, he uttered words that ring down the ages and enlighten our present. He said, "On your decision hang the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves. You, my friends, are the custodians and inheritors of the finest constitutional dispensation evolved by human intelligence. You now have the responsibility to invigilate and preserve that tradition and to hand it on intact to those who come after On your decision hang the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves.
Dan, thank you very much for a tremendous, very powerful presentation. I think music to the ears of everyone here today. And we now have time for some questions from the audience. And we already have a question over here from the gentleman in the middle row there.
Well, thank you very much. Your historical insight that war on the continent had led to the growth of the state, that war is the health of the state, as has been said, is, I think, spot on and certainly verified in history. What do you make of our current situation in this country? We've been now in perpetual war for perpetual peace for the past decade or so. What do you think that has done, if anything, to our liberties?
Plainly, there is a price to be paid. The expansion of government for the purpose of waging war carries a domestic price in terms of diminished freedom. There is that contradiction in Russell Kirk's famous phrase between an American republic and an American empire. I have to say, though, coming as an observer, as a friend of this country, but nonetheless as an occasional visitor, I am slightly shocked by how polarized this argument over foreign policy has become between two doctrinaire positions. There is a view that says all foreign intervention is wrong. Let's call it, in shorthand, the Rand Paul view of the world. We should never, ever get involved. And then there is a kind of, I don't know what you would call neocon, but okay, it didn't work out in Iraq. Let's try it in Syria, right? Now, what both of those points of view have in common is something that seems to me intrinsically unconservative, which is that they start with a theoretical template, and then they try and fit the facts to the theory. Now, that is not something that conservatives do. We should approach things case by case and say, where is it right to deploy proportionate force in defense of liberty? So I am, for example, incredibly grateful that this country was prepared to wage 3 wars for liberty in the 20th century. There were 3 global conflagrations, the First and Second World Wars and the Cold War, between the 2 rival models, the one that put the individual above the state and the one that did the opposite. Right? The list of countries on the right side in all 3 of those wars is a short one. But it includes your country and mine and the rest of the Anglosphere. It doesn't follow that the US is freighted with the responsibility of being an imperial power. Your founders understood better than anybody that colonies are ungrateful and expensive. When you have a $17 trillion debt, you do not have the luxury of maintaining garrisons all over the world. So you need to pick and choose. I was an opponent of the Iraq War at the time. I was unusual among conservatives at the time, but I think I can now say at this distance in time, wouldn't you have rather kept the $1 trillion for something else, knowing what we now know? I was an opponent of Syrian intervention. But I do see that there may be a case for a direct involvement in Iran if that were the way of preventing Iranians from acquiring nuclear technology. You have to approach these things case by case. I'm often accused of being a sort of American stooge, as British people are by our continental friends. You're just an aircraft carrier. And I always give them the same answer. Our shared heritage shapes us in similar ways. When we are confronted by the same problem, we react in a similar fashion because we've been taught by our institutions to do so. And part of that shared heritage is a readiness to take up arms in defense of freedom.
Gentleman over here.
I'm sorry. Is this on? I'm sorry that your paths did not cross yesterday in Philadelphia with Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, because he has a book tour also. I hope you read each other's. He is a believer and a practitioner of Tocquevillian democracy. Just as an aside, I would like you to explain, please, what you meant in the paper Saturday by the United States being unique as a propositional state.
Okay. First of all, my path did actually cross Governor Walker's in New York, and he is a great man who has turned his state into a template of job creation and individual liberty, and I was honored to have the chance to thank him for doing that. Why is the US unique in being creedal? Well, it goes right back to the beginning. It goes right back to the first pilgrim settlers, even before the Revolution. That famous line of John Winthrop's about the city on the hill, the eyes of all people shall be upon us. What's less quoted is the thing he said just before that. We are entered into a contract and covenant with God. We are here to live in a particular way in gratitude for having been given this country. That was early in the DNA of this country. And you don't have to be a Puritan, you don't have to be a Christian, you don't have to be a believer to see the importance of people feeling that they have an ideology bigger than where they happen to live. That then took form in the Revolution in a constitution that defined nationality ideologically. No country in the world has been so good at assimilating newcomers from other places and making them feel part of that shared inheritance. People can come from Asia, from South America, from Africa, and they are turned into Americans, and they become patriotic and freedom-loving, and their view of the world is Americanized. Very few countries have pulled that trick off as well as you have. There was that lovely, characteristically optimistic phrase of Ronald Reagan where he said, "Every immigrant makes America more American." Now, I know this is controversial. There are going to be some of you in the room thinking, I was with this guy up until now on the immigration thing. This is... You know what? You can't read American history without being struck by something. Every generation of Americans, every single generation, has taken the view that immigration was always a good thing up until now. But this time it's different. Right? And there's always an apparently plausible reason for thinking that. But up until now they were all English speaking. Up until now they were all Protestants. You know what? It's never been true. This is still an amazingly successful country, and the fact that the in queue is so much longer than the out queue is a tribute to what you're achieving here. But you have to be proud of it. Give the settlers, give the newcomers something that they want to belong to. Don't go around apologizing. Where does that leave the guy who's trying to settle in? Give people patriotism.
Gentleman in front.
Yes. Thank you, Mr.
And please do identify yourself
Yes,
in any
I'm Randy
affiliation.
Foreman.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Hannan, thank you for coming to the United States. I want to turn to British politics for a second. Where do you see UKIP go, the UKIP party going? How do you work with Nigel Farage in the EU Parliament, and why have you not decided to go the route of UKIP? We're going to
Thank you. Nigel is a good friend of mine. He and I both represent the same region. That could be a recipe for a very bad relationship, but it isn't. He's always been a wonderful gentleman and a colleague. I think that the fracturing of the centre-right in the UK could be devastating. Similar thing happened in Canada at the beginning of the 90s. There were two right-of-centre parties. They have the same electoral system that you have and that we have, majoritarian, first past the post. It ruthlessly punishes that kind of division. And the risk is that if the right-of-centre Eurosceptic vote is split between two different parties, then Labour will get in with a minority of the vote, but with a large majority in Parliament. That's the quirk of our electoral system. So I think there needs to be some kind of rapprochement between UKIP and the Conservative Party. If we can't do that, I mean, look, if we were all rational calculating machines, we'd have already done this, right? The logic is so overwhelming. But of course, human nature gets in the way, and personal animosities and rivalries get in the way. But if they were to prevent a deal and thereby put Labour back into government, giving them the car keys all over again to trash it, to exhaust our treasury and our credit all over again, that, I think, would reflect badly on all concerned. My party will have a referendum, if we win, on leaving the European Union. Right? The only way to get that referendum to happen so that we can walk away from the European Union and rejoin the community of English-speaking democracies is to get people in the House of Commons who will go through the right lobbies when the moment comes. And if UKIP were to be the vehicle that prevented that outcome, I think all of us would be to blame.
Question right at the back there.
Adam Brickley, I'm with Heritage. We talk a lot, since we're in the United States, about the Anglo-American relationship, the role of Britain and the United States. But I wanted to pull back to the broader Anglosphere, since I know you're a specialist in that, and wondered if you might address the other commonly accepted Anglosphere nations and their roles, namely Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and then maybe a quick word on whether our Irish friends are drifting out of that with their political system.
Sure. I think the other three, if you like, core Anglosphere countries are much better exemplars of Anglosphere exceptionalism and liberty than either my country or yours. If the free world has leaders now, they are Stephen Harper and Tony Abbott, and to a lesser extent John Key in New Zealand. I'm afraid if you want to find individualist, law-based parliamentary government working well, you wouldn't look at either the US or the UK at the moment. But I'm hopeful. I mean, first of all, on Ireland, they have the moment of maximum orbital distance, the apastron from the rest of the Anglosphere, has long since passed in the Irish Republic. There has been an approximation between the UK and Ireland in politics which would have seemed extraordinary 20 years ago. There was always intermixture and intermarriage and intermingling between the populations. I mean, on a cultural level, a visitor from the other side of the world would find it hard to understand what the fight had been about. You know, everyone's watching the same TV, following the same football teams, listening to the same music. But the politics had always remained apart until very recently. That the approximation of the two countries was sealed by the Queen's visit last year, which is now being returned by the President of the Republic next year to the UK. Even down to the pardoning of the people who had deserted from the Irish army to fight for the Anglosphere in the Second World War. That was a tacit admission by the Kenny regime that the law itself was wrong, that Ireland should have been playing its part as an Anglosphere ally in the battle against Hitler. So relations have never been better, and I think Ireland is now convincingly rejoining the Anglosphere. But let me say that applies big time to a country that is a lot larger than Ireland, and indeed a lot larger than Britain, and larger than the US. The biggest Anglophone common law democracy in the world is India. Now, I'm not sure we can talk about India joining the Anglosphere, because you don't talk about a country with twice the population of all the rest of it put together joining it. But a positive relationship between India and the rest of the Anglosphere is, for me, the central challenge of this century, geopolitically. Like Ireland, and indeed like the American Republic, India, in the early stages after independence, underlined the fact of its independence by doing things differently. So a generation went down the road towards autarky, Swadesh and Swadeshi, self-reliance, equidistance between the Western and Soviet blocs, promoting Hindi as the common language, and great preparation for the internet age that would have been. Right? But that's over. India has become more Anglosphere now than it was last decade or the decade before that. It's become more Anglophone. And if you like, the colonial cringe has gone, because Anglosphere culture now is accented in American rather than British. And so there's no implication that you're nostalgic for the old regime. What India now, how it now defines itself against its neighbours, is through its Anglosphere characteristics. There are regular elections. Nobody gets exiled or shot. The army doesn't interfere in politics. English has become the language not just of government, but of the universities, of business. And critically, there is a legal system open to the individual seeking redress that preserves property rights through common law. Now, I reckon that if you place India at the heart of an enlarged Anglosphere alliance based on free trade, suddenly the 21st century looks a lot brighter.
Question over here.
Sam Coates, I have a sort of particular perspective on this as a fellow British Tory, but also one who's I worked with our sister party in Australia and now in the Conservative government in Canada. So I really sort of relate to what you're saying. As a follow-up to that question, you've been very eloquent about our historical bonds. So I'd be interested in just building on what you said about the Anglosphere Alliance, in terms of what are the practical ways moving forward the sort of English-speaking peoples of freedom can do to work together. Like, we've got the Five Eyes community, which is more of a security than a political thing, and then obviously the Commonwealth as well. So I'd just be interested in how we can actually...
Well, being Anglosphere peoples, we should be modest and practical and pragmatic and not visionary. I mean, I've had enough of visionary schemes. I've been a member of the European Parliament for 15 years. Heaven knows we don't need any plans for currency unions or pan-Anglosphere parliaments or anything like that. Let's stick to something achievable and realistic and that goes with the temper of our peoples. I would settle for a free trade area with an element of free movement, labour mobility, and an enhanced military alliance, which we're very close to already. I made this point earlier about reacting in the same way to the same events because we've been shaped by our institutions. Lovely vignette. 10 years ago, the Indian Ocean was devastated by that terrible tsunami. And the cleanup operation was coordinated by the US, Australian, and Indian navies. They found a greater interoperability than is typically found among NATO allies, despite the fact that India had up until then had only the most perfunctory ties with the other two. Why? Because they had the same habit of thought, because they had the same political structures. So I would settle simply for that, an enhanced alliance based on prosperity.
Question back there.
Jordan Long, the Heritage Foundation. My question is, to what extent do you see traditional Anglosphere liberties and rights being grounded in a theory of natural law as opposed to just sort of happy historical happenstance?
There is a huge difference between our tradition and the continental tradition. The continental, I've not claimed that the Anglosphere invented law, right? That the fathers of the English were grubbing around with their pigs in the cold soil of North Germany when Moses was coming down from Sinai. Right? That was someone else got there way before we did. Nor do I claim we invented democracy. That is a very old word for a very old concept. What we invented was constitutional liberty. And our concept of democracy was as a guardian of individual freedom rather than as an expression of the will of the majority. There is an immense philosophical and practical difference between the continental tradition of Jacobinism, of the French Revolution, tradition ultimately rooted in Herder, in Rousseau, in the concept of the collective, of the general will of the people, and our system, which is practical, individualist, and that points to specific rights contractually guaranteed. And I have to say, ours has worked better. We didn't ever fall to fascism or communism, to dictatorship or revolution. In fact, in the whole of the Anglosphere, we never elected a single fascist MP, and no more than half a dozen communists in all of the Anglosphere countries in all of the 20th century. I think we have one in the House of Commons at the moment, actually, rather bizarrely. That's a pretty good record. You think that, 800,000 members of the French Communist Party, 1.6 million members of the Italian, when we talk about the West, the Western tradition, we're being polite. Right? We mean countries that adopted the Anglo-American system of government as a result of military victories by the English-speaking peoples. If the Second World War or the Cold War had ended differently, they would not be Western values today.
Gentleman back.
Hi, my name is Carl Oswald. I'm here privately. I'd like to know what you think of the remainder of this century for the Anglosphere exceptionalism. How will it bear up in the face of challenges from powerful but not democratic countries? Thank you.
I'm optimistic. And this always puts me in a minority in conservative audiences. Right? Pessimism seems to be part of the conservative temperament. We are hardwired to expect imminent catastrophe. It's a bit like what I was saying about the immigration thing before. It's always different this time. Right? And every generation has a different catastrophe looming. Right? It could be ice ages, or it could be global warming, or it could be bird flu, or swine flu, or it could be asteroid strikes, or nuclear holocaust, or drugs-resistant superbugs, or Islamization, or the debt crisis. The cause changes decade to decade, but the argument doesn't. The argument is always, this time it's going to be different. And maybe it will, but it never has been yet. So I am actually pretty optimistic. I think the Anglosphere emphasis on individualism is perfectly suited to the internet age. And I suspect that a generation from now, Americans will be living happier, longer, healthier, and more fulfilled lives than at any time in the past. Now, I could have made that statement at any time since the Mayflower, and people would have scoffed at it. The people would have been sitting in their breeches and with their flagons going, oh, rubbish, it's been good up until now, but this time it's going to be different. It would have always been true. I think you can look forward to a bright prospect here with driverless cars and additive and subtractive manufacturing and incredible advances in healthcare and genetic technology and so on. The future is bright. It's true you have this huge debt crisis, but there's going to be a way around that. I mean, if a government can't pay, it won't pay. And then when there's a default, People won't lend it any more money. It's going to have to live within its means. There's an upside even there, right? And I think that the Anglosphere values are transferable. Someone, my book has been on sale for 2 days now. I'm sure that if you look at the Amazon site now, people will have said this is a very racist, smug, triumphalist, imperialist, colonialist book. But before they've had a chance to read any of it. I mean, that's what always happens. But the great thing about Anglosphere values is they will take root anywhere. They are why Bermuda is not Haiti. They are why Singapore is not Indonesia. They're why Hong Kong isn't China. If you get the structures right, the liberty and the happiness will follow.
Dan, just a closing question. We're almost out of time, but very quickly, what do you think of Obamacare?
Yeah, so I can do that in 30 seconds. I think it should be... all right. I think there is a need for healthcare reform. When people showed all these polls saying 80% of Americans support healthcare reform, I find it incredible that 20% didn't, right? I mean, we can all think of things that we would do to improve the current system, to change the litigation rules. I would like to see a system of personal healthcare accounts where you can carry your portable account with you instead of having it based on insurance, right? I think a Singapore-style system. But reform should be approached in the spirit of the Constitution, respecting the jurisdiction of the 50 states and respecting the supremacy of the individual. Now, what I would say, I mean, what do I know about this? My website still works, but I would make just one point about this, which is if you go down the road towards a state-run healthcare system, you will find that you switched the incentives so that people begin to depend on the new dispensation, right? One of the most brilliant phrases ever uttered in politics was that fantastic insight of Milton Friedman's "the tyranny of the status quo." I sometimes think you have to have actually served as a representative to see how perspicacious those words are. The tyranny of the status quo. Once you have the government supplying healthcare, physicians and administrators and politicians and even patients start to depend on the existing system, and it then becomes impossible to attempt any radical reform. That's pretty much the situation where the United Kingdom is today. So if you are going to go down this road, you embrace it properly and you grit your teeth and you do it. Otherwise, don't start down the road at all. But don't imagine that 4 or 5 years from now you can say, oh, this didn't really work. Maybe we can reverse it. It's not going to work like that. This is your one chance.
Dan, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Daniel Hannan for a tremendous speech today and Q&A session as well. And Dan, you're very welcome to come back to Heritage at any time. We'd love to have you back here. And very grateful to all of you for joining us as well today here at Heritage. Dan will now be signing copies of his book. I believe they're all sold, actually, Dan. So they all went like hotcakes earlier. So if you'd like Dan to sign your book, please do bring it up. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. And thank you especially to Dan Hannan for a terrific presentation. Thank you.